Hi, I'm Daxter. This is a video. Like and subscribe. Hit that sub button. Yeah. What are you doing?
Yeah, hi.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, or whatever time it is that you're watching this. My name is Mr. Robinson, and I'm here today to go over pretty much everything from Jefferson buying the Louisiana Purchase all the way through the end of Manifest Destiny, which leads us to regional sectionalism that would be the cause of the Civil War. Now, in order to do well in this test, there's a couple of things that you're going to need to follow along with. First off, is the concept that we know that these new political parties are forming, and it's ultimately going to lead to what we call sectionalism, this idea that you're going to have multiple different regions with different personal and political beliefs. It's also going to be affecting the way they make those decisions. So when we look at this time period, it starts with Jefferson. Now, when Jefferson buys the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, he buys it from Napoleon Bonaparte. Remember, he's an Italian guy, but he was actually French. He was born in Italy, but moved to France as a child. And it's an important thing to keep in mind because Napoleon had bigger, more grand plans in mind for what he wanted. Now, while much of Europe had gone through the age of empires during the last 2 centuries, Napoleon had a better idea. So instead of going after the smaller, more regional territories, his grand plan was to conquer the conquerors. He was going to try to create an empire throughout Europe and create himself as an emperor. So Napoleon had really no need for the continental United States or anything in it. Now keep in mind, Napoleon and France itself had bought back the Louisiana Purchase from the Spanish after the French and Indian War, and they felt that it was surplus to requirements. It really wasn't needed. It was something that they didn't really want. So what did we, the United States, come to realize? Well, if the French don't need it, there's only really one piece of land that we desperately want. And that, of course, was New Orleans. Having access to New Orleans means you have control of the Mississippi River. You maintain and control all trade going up and down the coast. But also what's really important is, if you control New Orleans, you control pretty much every military particular installation all the way up and down the Mississippi River. You protect yourself from having any undue necessary cause for people to invade you. Now, we sent, of course, James Monroe and Robert Livingston over to France to negotiate the deal. They would come back with a deal at $15 million. That would be a huge bargain at the time. But of course, the biggest trick is how much land we got. Roughly 180,000 square miles, which would equate to about between 3 to 4 cents per acre. That is a killing. If you think about it, modern day, we're paying about $10,000 per acre. So if you think about it, that's a good deal. So when we look at the Louisiana Purchase, it caused a lot of political firestorms back at home. Remember, Thomas Jefferson was an anti-federalist. He believed that the federal government has really no business getting involved in things that the Constitution does not guarantee it. Now, because the Constitution does not say that the federal government or the president himself can buy more territory, most Federalists would argue, well, that would fall into the necessary and proper clause, that the federal government should be able to do those things and as a sense that it's active duty to create treaties and negotiations with other countries. But Thomas Jefferson, who was a very well-known anti-federalist, usually would not agree to such conditions because anti-federalists would ultimately say that if it does not say it in the Constitution, then it cannot be done. They were strict interpretationalists. This creates the notion that Thomas Jefferson, the biggest of all anti-federalists, kind of comes across as a little hypocritical. It comes across as he would say one thing, and then when he becomes president of the United States, he did a completely different thing. And I don't really, as a historian, we look back on it, and of course, was the writing on the wall there to say, this was too good of a deal to pass up. You can't not do the deal. Well, sure, but the side effect of the Louisiana Purchase would ultimately be the fact that it expands presidential power. And then we get to Jackson, and we're gonna get to Jackson. He's gonna push that out to a limit that we didn't even see coming. When we get to the Indian Removal Act, blatant disregard of Supreme Court decisions. It gets wild. So now it's 1804. We bought this land. We have all this stuff. What are we going to do with it? Well, more importantly, who's going to go look at it? And that's when we, of course, create the Lewis and Clark expedition with Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. They would go off and explore this territory, of course, with the core of destiny. The core of discovery, not the discovery of corpse. Guys, C-O-R-P-S in this particular case is core, not corpse. I know it's odd. Think Marine Corps. Now, the Corps of Discovery was put together, and their goal was to go and seek out what was on this land that we just paid all that money for and go and figure this out. This was like a mission to the moon in its time. No one had ever gone on such a long landfaring expedition, and ultimately, we didn't really even know what we were going to find. Remember, at this time, they thought they could actually still find mammoths out here. Mammoths, like Manny from Ice Age. If only we found Manny from Ice Age. But in reality, what we were to find was a significant abundance of resources, rivers, and waterways. We took an offshoot during the middle of the expedition to go and find the source of the Missouri River. We came across a gigantic set of mountain ranges. Of course, we know those as the Colorado Rockies to this day. And of course, a pathway to the Pacific Ocean. That was the goal. So when we think of his group, there was a couple of key members, of course, Meriwether Lewis, who was only 28 at the time during the expedition, his former military commander, and William Clark. We would also see that that Clark would bring along his slave, who he had been with since as childhood, York. He'd actually be the first African American to vote in any democratic decision in American history, so that's kind of a neat thing there. A key interpreter along the way was Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, and then, of course, his wife at the time, who was young, of course, was the Shoshone Native American Sacagawea. Now, most kids pronounce it Sacagawea. The correct pronunciation is Sacagawea. Now, she, of course, would help translate, show the way, guide them to getting horses, and, of course, showed that to other Native Americans that we were peaceful, because clearly we wouldn't take a Native American along with us if our full intention was to destroy them all as we came. This was a 2-year expedition. It took 18 months to literally get from Missouri to Seattle. And when you think about it that way, it's actually a 2.5-hour flight modern day, but they didn't really know where they were going. And of course they had to make camp multiple times, especially when you get up into the Rockies because of how cold it was. So it's really important to know that the Lewis and Clark expedition kind of paved the way for America to kind of get into that mindset of what is manifest destiny. Now, the idea of manifest destiny would be born with the Lewis and Clark expedition because this notion that America should control everything from sea to shining sea, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, we should control everything in between. And over the course of numerous presidencies and roughly 4 decades, the American ideal, or the manifest destiny dream, would become a reality. But before this would happen, because of that presidential expansion of power from Jefferson, we would see a particularly big change in how presidencies would run. Now, when Jackson comes to power, a lot of things had happened. Of course, Madison becomes president, and we have Monroe. But then we get to John Quincy Adams. This is for the first time we have the child of a former president in power. And this is where that term nepotism comes in. For those of us who don't know what nepotism is, it means that you got your position, rank, or place in a particular organization because of who your family is, not necessarily of your own particular talents. Now, because John Quincy Adams was seen as the heir apparent to this next upcoming presidency, there was another candidate out there in the same party, no less, in the Democratic Republican Party, who was causing a lot of people to turn their heads, and his name was Andrew Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson, he was Trump before Trump. He was a populist president. He was what they called the man of the people. And that is mostly because Andrew Jackson did things a lot differently.